I'm Phil Steiger. I oversee the data management team here at KETIV. Jason and Jose both work on the data management team. Jason is our architect, and Jose is our vault engineer. So let's get started. Got a couple poll questions before we get going. So the first one, do you know where all the files you have? Do you know what all the file types you have? Do you have the application to access those files? And how many CAD tools have you used? Give you a few moments to fill out the poll question. Wow, a lot of, I wasn't expecting well, if you've been in business for a long time, I'm not surprised at the amount of different CAD tools, because companies seem, and that's a real theme of today's conversation, is that, I mean, the amount of CAD tools that you end up changing over the years in business. So it's good to know.
And it ties into that number two, right? Do you have access to that application for those files? We'll talk a little bit more about that, but the more you use,
the more you maintain.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so today's an overview of what we're going to talk about today. Now that you know where all your data is, what do you do with it? Next is you determine what stays and what goes, because it's real easy to say, hey, I got all this data and now I'm going to go to a PDM and let's just put all this data into a PDM. There's a good and bad about that, and you don't need to put junk in there. You really want to be due diligent of what you're putting in your PDM, and then create a plan to execute on it.
And that Christina mentioned it earlier, but we've done another webinar on this series. If this is the first time you jump on with us today on this specific topic, kind of addressing that first bullet point, like, do you know where your data is, kind of thing. So if you need to find out where that is, be a good one to watch.
Yes. It's surprising how many people don't know where all their data is, or they go to do searching on their data and realize that it's scattered across multiple servers and multiple folders. And that's really why you need a PDM, because what happens is it ends up not only being stored on servers, but on people's local machines, in their, on their hard drive, and you have no control over that thing, of if it's getting backed up or being saved or accidentally deleted. So now that you know where all your data is, first thing I think you should do is create a list of all the different file types, so you have a better understanding of all the file types that you have, so that you can validate that you have the appropriate application to open those. And you'd be surprised that, just because you're using application X and you have a file that goes with that application, you can get into a situation where the application is so new and the file is so old that you can't actually open that file anymore. And we've had customers come to us and ask us, hey, we got files from 2011 and we're using 2021 and it doesn't open. Is there some way for you guys to migrate this for us? And we've had to write scripts and get special permission from Autodesk to use older applications to actually convert files. So in thinking not only about this whole idea of going to a PDM, but then also once you're in a PDM, what is your plan in the future when you upgrade the PDM to make sure that you migrate all those files every so often? Because you get 10 years down the road and you go to access that file and can't access it, that could be a big problem.
And that's also where, like, creating and maintaining, PDFs for the release version, so that you at least have something that you can very easily reference 10, 15, 20 years later. Because maybe you don't want or need access. Maybe it's a one-off design so you don't need access to it. Every business case is slightly different, but it's something to think about so that you're planning for the future, not just waiting. And then you find yourself in these interesting positions.
Right. And then, it's comparing the file types with available applications. It's amazing how you don't realize that, oh my God, I was using X application and now we don't have it. Oh, and you might have that application, but is it licensed? And if you have it, why are you paying for licensing for an application you might not be using anymore? I mean, there's costs involved. And goes into validating the application, you still have a license and it works. Even though you have it, do you need it? And that's where you have to start thinking long-term. Do we really need this application anymore? What should we be doing with these files? Things like that.
What's the main goal behind those files and such kind of thing,
Right.
moving forward?
Mhm.
You mentioned having those applications and just thinking back on the poll answers as to how many different tools have been used. Like, you may think it's one, and then you find that random drive that has been storing files from like 15 years ago, and you're like, oh, we used that back then, maybe before certain people started. Maybe everybody that used it back then is no longer at the company. So, you may have used more tools than you know.
Right. And it might even be in the same ecosystem as far as application vendor is concerned. It might be all Autodesk or all SolidWorks, but even that, you run into those problems. And I can think back in a previous life where I can think of 4 different applications that were used over, a 10-year period as we, evolved from using just 2D all the way into Inventor and 3D. But there were multiple different applications we were using to get to that point, and how much of those files ever got upgraded after we moved to the new systems. So now that you have, now it's time to determine what stays and what goes. And I think this is the hardest part for any business to make that decision. What files are important? What files need to go into your PDM solution? And I'm a big advocate that all engineering data should be put into one system and in one location, because it's about time. If you're paying an engineer, he's got a run rate of $100 an hour, and he's spending an hour looking for a file because you got files in 2 or 3 different locations. It's $100 wasted time. So it is important to make sure all the files get into your PDM solution, but at the same time, not everything needs to go in there. What I'm saying is, maybe it doesn't need to be an actual drawing or the actual Inventor file. I'll use Inventor, but maybe it can be just a PDF. Maybe you don't need the actual application file that it was created in, because you're never going to touch it again, or you're never going to change it. And that's some of the things that you look at, and I put on here, just because you can doesn't mean you should. But then at the same time, you ask yourself, well, is that file ever going to need to be updated or changed, or is it just a reference file? Well, if it's just reference and you're never going to use it again, maybe you create it as a PDF and you store it as a PDF and you remove the application file. Or should you be converting those files from whatever the current application it was created in to whatever application you're using today? So maybe it's a SolidWorks file, and now you guys are using Inventor. Should you, that way you can eliminate licensing costs. So you're not keeping around SolidWorks licenses just so you can open up these files. I mean, it's all about cost savings.
And who's viewing it, right? So if like you're sharing these drawings with sales, maybe they're looking at older orders and for certain customers, and they're using a free viewer, even if it's not costing you licenses, right? If you're using a free viewer, when you transfer them into your data management solution, you could, if you're storing them, you can place them in certain locations and have them use, a viewer as well to view them pretty quickly, search through the metadata as they're indexed.
And this also goes to like purchase parts in any PDM solution. It's like the longer it takes you to find what you need, that takes time because you're going to reuse it. You know, do you need all those one-off unique pieces, or can you standardize or shrink down some of your components? You're not looking through so many.
Well, and we have a lot of customers come to us and say, well, my vault is growing and it's getting big, and how do I get it under control? Well, this exercise here to think about that, if you don't have a PDM solution today, will help so that you know what's going in there is only stuff that has a value to it and not just junk. And we talk a lot as a team about the value of a drawing doesn't have value, as much value anymore as it did 20, 30 years ago when it was on a piece of paper. It's digital now. And I don't know, we don't value that drawing as much as we did. We create a lot of extra stuff today digitally instead of, you know, making sure what we create has substance and value. It's like I was talking the other day about photographs. I mean, back in the day, you would take pictures, you'd get them developed, they had value, these pictures, they were something tangible you could hold. Today we have cell phones and everybody's taking pictures. I got like 7,000 pictures on my cell phone. Huh? Because we can, doesn't mean we should. So.
Definitely.
Yeah, and growth isn't a bad thing, right? Sorry, Jason, to cut you off there. Growth isn't a bad thing. Sometimes you get a little surprised with seeing the vault grow, and that's one of the things we keep track of. When we do vault as a service, like, oh well, from this 1 month to the next, you grew like this many gigabytes. Are you guys creating a lot of new projects? Are you guys doing this? It's not necessarily bad as long as you understand what you're adding, right? Is essential, is necessary, is adding value to your company, and the drawings are quality drawings at that point. So, people always, sometimes they get scared when they see their storage kind of increase and they're running low on space. Space is, I guess I would say, the cheaper option there. Like if you're growing naturally and healthily, like that's fine. You'll always want your company to keep growing and the data that you're creating to create value as well.
And every company grows at different speeds. People that make, let's say, 3 phones that sell billions of units is very different than a company that makes a one-off product for 1,000 customers.
Yes. So now that you have all this information, it's time to create the plan to prepare for you to take all your data and get ready to put it into a PDM solution. And when you're creating that plan, things you're going to have to start to think about: folder structure, naming conventions, properties, the metadata and revisions. These are all critical things that you want to think about before you embark on a PDM solution, because I can tell you that we get a lot of customers who go in and start a PDM and they get 2 or 3 years in, and then they're like, well, man, I wish we'd have done this, and maybe we should have looked at that beforehand. And it's a lot cheaper to spend more time up front than it is later on, and then have to pay somebody like us to come in and have to clean it up and get you back on track because your naming convention isn't right. Well, maybe I should have used items in the beginning, and now I have to go back and do this stuff. Jason and Jose can speak about having to deal with this on an ongoing basis with a lot of customers.
And it goes back to, when you're setting up any PDM system, you don't know what you don't know. And it's sometimes taking that time up ahead of time and thinking 5-10 years down the road, what do you need? Will this system be linked into other things? Or is the files that are getting added to the PDM system have BOM data, and do you want to see that BOM data? There's a lot of things to think about. The biggest one is definitely around properties and metadata. It's like, sure, you can add new properties, you can add more metadata, but it's easy to make the changes and it affects new files added to a PDM system, but it is very time consuming to go back and add metadata later.
Yeah, one of the questions I always ask is, what's important to you? Like, what would you like to see? What is necessary for your data to be valuable and correct the first time around, right? You don't want to go back in and fix it later on, like Jason said. So what's important to you? And that kind of gets, wheels turning, and they're like, oh, well, you've never actually thought about it. And it's a good conversation starter, because if you're working with a group, different departments might have different information that's valuable to them. And eventually you come to a consensus of what properties you want to bring in and what properties, they're linked to on the actual file.
Well, the other thing you got to think about is, it's the buzzword right now is that whole digital transformation. And going to a PDM solution and you're getting all your data in there, that's like the first step, because now all your data is in a PDM solution. Now, how do you leverage that clean data that you put in there with all that information, maybe to your ERP system, so that now I can maybe have bonds automatically push to the ERP, so I'm not having to pay somebody to do that intermediate step, which, let's all be realistic, when you have humans doing that kind of stuff, there are going to be errors. People fat finger things, so then you maybe want to look at a PLM solution, maybe you have CRM. So there's a lot of other things to take into account when you're getting ready to go to a PDM solution. It's like the first step.
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of other things that, it could potentially do down the road. So that's why you want to put a lot of thought into it beforehand.
Yeah. File naming, practices is a big one, because changing that later is a lot of work. But especially when I think about metadata, it's like one of the tenets of any PDM system is reuse. And you can't reuse something if you can't find it. And there's an interesting balance between adding the metadata that adds value versus adding all the metadata. There's such a thing as too much. There's no point to add all this metadata that no one searched on. It doesn't add any new value.
And then it's time for execution, and who's going to do the execution? Who's going to do the PDM configuration? You guys doing it on your own, or are you paying somebody like KETIV to help you? Data loading and testing, these are all things that come into play now that you have all your data all set up, ready to go. And I tell you what, if all your data is all nice and clean, I love that word, but ready to go, it's going to make that transition into a PDM solution much, much smoother.
And depending on how old, that data is, in that execution plan, there may be some other tools involved. Like, how do we, if that information exists in your CAD files, how do we extract it? Like, will it require, can you do it by yourself? First of all, like, if you have those tools, can you do it? Or, you ask someone like us, like a KETIV, like, can you get me this information? We know it exists. We want to include it in our data. What would be the best way to, mass grab all this information? So it's something that you want to know going into forming your plan, because, else you get down to execution, you're like, actually, there's information we need. We didn't know it was attached to this data. So it's all like getting it as close to perfect the first time, and that way you can build up on it as you go.
Yeah. You guys have anything else to add to this? Any other thoughts around what they should also look out for? Gotchas.
I think one of the
Biggest
things
thing is, go ahead.
you go first.
It's around testing, you would save yourself a lot of time to spend a couple extra weeks or however long it's required to, set up a PDM system, figure it, load in one or two, like one old project, one new project, and just do one project in a new PDM system, because, you might not know what you don't know. And by doing one, you might be like, oh, it'd be nice if we had these few extra features. That's the time where you can really change almost anything with minimal effort. And so it's tempting to want to roll it out fast, but taking the extra time, I think, makes a big difference.
Yeah, I think that's where my point was going to go to similarly as well. As you're rolling this out, you may be working in multiple systems, whether it be that network drive, whether it be, but as long as you know how they're distributed and you know that for certain files, you go to this system, for certain files, moving forward, you may go to your new PDM system. As long as that's outlined, you can keep track of it and make sure that it's still moving forward without getting back into the chaos of having everything be everywhere all at the same time.
Well, the other thing I don't think we've touched on is thinking about, since you go into a PDM solution, having them automatically generate PDFs of all your files when on release. Especially, you're sharing documents with outside customers, PDFs is secure as far as, they can't edit the PDF. And then internally, you have a copy of that data that you're always going to be able to open going forward.
And with Pro, it's revision controlled, right? So the revision of the PDF will match the revision of the drawing that it was created from. So you'll be able to be sure that it's accurate to when it was released.
Yeah. This is a shorter session today. I don't really have any other things. We do have another one coming up and more about how to get your PDM prepared for all your data. And it's our next webinar. Anybody have any questions that we can answer?
Feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A session.
I mean, and our whole goal of this 3-part session is to really, make you successful.
Yeah, because it's easier to get PDM system set up than it is to have to come back and fix it 5 years later.
Yeah.
And the whole goal is, right, adoption. There we go. Adoption of the tool, right? So, even if we customers or users are in PDM, if it's not set up correctly the first time, it causes more headaches than it solves, and you eventually stop using it because now none of your users are going to the PDM tool to grab these files. They all revert back to the network drive, so it just ends up not being helpful. So we want to make sure that you guys deploy it or are able to make it work for you.
You guys see the question about PDF versus DWIF?
Yeah, so the main difference really is, if we think about vendors, it really comes down to a preference between a PDF and a DWIF. There's free viewers for both. They both download. They're both basically identical. But I find a fair amount of customers like PDFs just because it's easy to attach, and most people already have a PDF viewer versus people outside of engineering or 3D modeling might not have a DWIF viewer. But that is correct. In file-based lifecycle, and let's say Vault as an example, the job processor will generate a PDF on release and sync the rev number of that file as well, so that it's a controlled document. And so that just makes it easier to control who has access to it, whether it's through the thin client, through the free web browser, or, you know, to be able to download it and mail it or email it to someone.
And next question about how far is too much metadata goes.
Okay, so as far as too much metadata goes, it's better to have additional iProperties that remain blank for some categories of product, or to have additional templates each contain their own unique iProperties. So that's an interesting one. I think of, like, if I was starting from scratch, I think of, you know, if we use the Vol example, you know, you have categories have properties. You need a landing spot in a PDM system so that the iProperty from a file has a place to go on check-in. And so what most commonly I see is that, you know, if you have a category for inventor data, then the inventor start parts have iProperties or custom iProperties. You can definitely add them and leave them blank. But I find, you know, if you add too many categories, the people modeling won't fill them out. Or you have this big list. And so it kind of depends on the way that I try to do it, is try to think of properties that multiple people can use that has appropriate metadata. And so that you're not making product specific categories, you're making categories that are more generic that can be used between different product lines.
Yeah, and you know, keeping in mind categories, you can make them required in certain categories, and make them widely available for, you know, files overall. What you want to start thinking about as well is, you know, for each category, if you're working in Vault Professional, you can make property compliance a thing. So this must be filled out, right? So if you make properties required, but only in certain categories, you have a little bit more granular control over that, and can make it so that certain categories may have the property available but don't require it, while other categories must have it filled out, and therefore as it gets released, you'll have better metadata available.
And I also think about, like, when you're thinking about metadata, it's like, what data do you want to see in your PDM system that you're going to search on, that you might sort by? Because not all metadata that's in the file necessarily needs to be linked to the PDM system for searching. And so it kind of depends. Do you want to see all of it? Are you going to search by all of it? One of the most unique use cases, and it only worked because a customer had all the metadata ahead of time, was something like, this little widget is made by this, you know, machine code. And so they mapped that property. And so when all the files went into Vault, you could very easily sort and see, if this machine was broken, which parts can I not manufacture? And so that was a very interesting place where you're, you know, without a PDM system, without metadata, it'd be very hard to kind of run that kind of, or get that kind of grouping without a lot of work. So there's some interesting things you can do with iProperties and metadata.
I can answer the next question. We offer a Vault Cloud service for customers. Size has nothing to do with being able to handle it. And if you know what your growth is year over year, we can size the Vault to handle the growth for over the next 3 years. 8.5 terabytes that's a lot of data in a vault. That's a big vault.
Might also come back to the whole, like, why is it growing a terabyte a year kind of thing. It could make perfect sense. Like we mentioned, it could just be you guys are growing and creating that much data a year. But you know, maybe you're storing, like Phil said, photos, videos, things like that. If that's something that happens, and you know, we can look into maybe either confirming that the growth is healthy, or seeing how we can help it kind of slow down there as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
is it 10 users? Is it 100 users? So many interesting questions.
And if you want to talk more about cloud services, shoot us an email and I'll get you in contact with our sales and we can have a meeting and talk about it and what we offer. Categories instead of file categories.
Okay, so the next question, we're using item categories instead of file categories for a long time. It was the way before I came to the company a few years ago. We are familiar with the future of which is more long-term and has an opinion on the topic. We're looking into switching our hundreds of thousands of files over. However, that would be an investment. Is it worth it? So you want to switch from item categories back to file categories? Am I reading that right?
That's what it sounds like, and I think primarily it'd be the reason why we want to switch back to files. That would be one of the things we would have to look into, right, Jason? Kind of like, what's the reasoning before switching back or switching over to file categories?
Yeah, it's like, what do you get? Is it simplifying the release process? Are you maintaining CAD files that don't have that much BOM data, or you're not leveraging the BOM data? Because that's the two questions that I think about when I think about items. I think about, does the files have BOM data, and do I need to see that BOM data outside of the CAD file? And do I have plans to link an item, a PDM item, to another system like PLM or ERP? Like, those are the two main things that I think about when I think about items. So to go back from items to file category, I think is definitely an interesting question. The workflow for releasing files in a file-based category is definitely simpler from an end user perspective, because it's less clicks, it's less things to manage. But it also depends. It would definitely be an investment to switch either forward or back. It doesn't matter which way you're going, and either way, it's an investment. I think the things that come to mind is, could you make the switch for new products, or do you want them all switched back? And one of the things that big drivers is, do you have your PDM system set up so that the revision on the item is pushing and maintaining the revision on the file? It's definitely worth reaching out, and so we can talk about it more.
Yeah, and it kind of, I know it started before you started at the company there, it sounds like, but if there's someone that was involved in that decision process, there hopefully were reasons that items were picked over file life cycles back then. So kind of weighing those options, is it something that the company's still moving towards in the future, or is it a plan that got abandoned some time ago?
But it's definitely something worth thinking about, and that's the hard part. When something's been or when companies make that decision before you get there, or everyone leaves that made that decision, it's worth investigating and making sure that they're still in alignment with your business needs and makes sense. Because both workflows work extremely well, but there's definitely features and pros and cons to both. And the most important thing is to pick one or the other and not do both. Or at least it's recommended not to do both. It makes it even more complicated.
There's always that one caveat, right? Like one niche scenario where well, we're gonna have to use both somehow. But yeah, typically you
Very
want to pick
rare.
one. It's one of those building blocks that we were talking about earlier, where you want to make those decisions early in the process when you're deploying the PDM, to make sure that your PDM system grows and builds accordingly. But if switching over, we're going to have to weigh the pros and cons, like Jason is mentioning.
Yeah, I saw that question. I need to update the slide.
I have the questions panel open up on my window here, so it's the only thing that I'm seeing on the screen now, and I can't unsee it.
Oh, well, yeah.
Looks like we have one person with their hand raised. Do you have a question? You want to put it in the chat? Yeah, these are great questions, and it's good to think about because all of these things can really kind of affect the growth and how you use the PDM system. And I'm a big component. If it adds value, great. Does it add value and complicate it? Simpler is better. If you can complicate it in less clicks or in less steps, time is money. So just because we can enable features and enable complicated workflows does not mean we should.
Right.
Unless it's, needed and adding value.
Our cloud services, we use Azure for our cloud service. And then we all in our cloud service, we can put it wherever your company is. So if you're located on the East Coast, we host it out of the East Coast and stuff like that. Plus, we also have a DR built in around our cloud service. So we have a 21-day backups that we keep in the cloud off of the server, so that in case something was to ever happen, we can restore your data from any point within the last 21 days. And plus, to go a little bit farther on that, we also harden the servers to the point where all passwords or any account that's in generic account that Vault creates, we go in and we change them to a 128-bit password to protect the Vault. Well, we've done that too.
So the question is exactly, that's the nice thing about the way that, Vault, for example, has the AVFS servers, and you can put AVFS servers in the cloud and put them in any data center worldwide. It works out quite nice.
And if they're local in the US, we haven't had to do AVFS. But if they're in the UK, we just finished one that we have a company in the US and then they have an office in India and we're doing AVFS. But then we have another company that has offices in California, Taiwan, and in Germany, and we host out of Taiwan, and they don't have AVFS at all with no issues. So,
something definitely worth exploring.
Yes.
And that's the nice thing about the AVFS servers is that it allows you to expand the reach and make it easy to allow multiple people access to your CAD data.
Plus, we have a lightweight VPN client that we also provide that allows, if you have people who travel and are going to need to access the Vault, they can use that, so they don't have to come back through your VPN and then into the cloud. They can direct connect to it. Well, if there is no other questions, I want to thank everybody for attending today. And Jose, Jason, I appreciate your time and your help today. I hope everybody has a great holidays, Christmas and New Year's, and we'll talk to you guys next year.
See you guys next time.